Have you ever gotten sick after eating something that you previously really enjoyed eating, and now just the smell of that food makes you feel queasy? Have you witnessed a new mom leak breast milk in the presence of someone else's baby? Do you crave snack foods when sitting in front of the television, even though you know you are still full from eating a meal? Did you know that drug addicts can overdose on small quantities of their drug if taken in an unfamiliar rather than a familiar place? Do you get a warm, fuzzy feeling inside when a certain song comes on the radio? What's up with all that? These may all be the result of what psychologists call classical conditioning. Welcome to the Psychology Department's video tutorial on classical conditioning and Pavlov's dogs. This video is just an introduction to classical conditioning. There will be other videos that address the human examples from the questions posed to you a moment ago. You may want to read your textbook section on classical conditioning first in order to familiarize yourself with the concepts. Or you might want to watch this video and then read your textbook. Either way, we recommend that you do both. Watch this video and read your textbook. It also helps to talk about the material with classmates, ask your instructor questions, and quiz yourself on the material in order to deepen your understanding and perform well on your exams. The chapter in your textbook is most likely called Learning. Classical conditioning is just one type of learning. Let's start by defining learning in general. Psychologists define learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience. This probably surprises you, because when most people think about learning, they think about the acquisition of knowledge. For example, you will be learning about classical conditioning in this video. I'm sorry that this causes some confusion. There is a historical reason for using the term learning to refer to behavioral change, but we will not get into that in this video. So, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior that results from experience. Theoretically, this learning occurs because it has some sort of adaptive value. That is, it increases our chances of survival. But how does this learning occur? Your textbook will discuss three different types of learning: classical conditioning, instrumental learning, also known as operant conditioning, and observational learning, also known as social learning or modeling. The Psychology Department offers other videos on operant conditioning and social learning. Classical conditioning is most associated with the early work of Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov is often credited with accidentally discovering classical conditioning while studying digestion using dogs in his laboratory. In fact, in 1904, Pavlov won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for his contribution to understanding the digestive system. In this picture, you see Pavlov performing an operation on one of his dogs, most likely to collect a sample of gastric juices. After accidentally discovering classical conditioning, Pavlov turned his research focus away from digestion to classical conditioning, which should give you an idea of how important he thought this new discovery was. Of course, digestion begins in the mouth, where saliva begins to break down the food we eat. So Pavlov collected a lot of saliva from his dogs. Here you see a figure of Pavlov's saliva collecting apparatus. Since dogs, and humans and other animals, salivate when food is put in their mouths, he began with presenting the dogs with some meat. The dogs were fitted with a tube connected to their salivary glands to collect the drool. The drool collected into a measuring cup, and the amount was recorded. Pavlov had many dogs and many lab assistants. What he noticed was that the dogs were drooling before the food was ever presented to them. They were drooling in anticipation of the food. They had learned to associate things in their environment with the food. It is a natural response to food to salivate, but these dogs were now salivating in a very unnatural way. Things in their environment that had been previously neutral for the dogs were now important signals that food was on its way, and this was making the dogs drool. For example, they might drool at the sight of a white lab coat or when hearing a lab assistant's footsteps in the hallway. He called this a conditional reflex. We now call this a conditioned response, and we call the process classical conditioning. Let's take a close look at the definition of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning occurs when a previously neutral stimulus comes to elicit a response through its associations with a stimulus that naturally brings about that response. This short definition can be confusing, and just memorizing this definition is not going to help you answer most of the test questions on classical conditioning. You need to understand all the parts of the definition and learn some new vocabulary too. Let's start by looking more closely at a stimulus that naturally brings about the response part of the definition. We are going to call that type of stimulus an unconditioned stimulus. This is because we use the word conditioned to mean learned. Unconditioned, therefore, means not learned, or it is natural. We are going to call the response to that unconditioned stimulus the unconditioned response. Again, this means that it was not learned, or it is natural. Hence, the unconditioned stimulus naturally causes the unconditioned response. We don't have to learn these. They are naturally occurring. Our body just does it. We pull our hand away from a hot stove before we even know that we have burned ourselves. The heat is the unconditioned stimulus that causes the withdrawal reflex. We could list a whole lot of examples. Here are just a few. Food in the mouth elicits salivation. Loud noise elicits a startle response. Irritants in the nose elicit sneezing. Wind in the face elicits blinking. Remember that these are all naturally occurring, visceral, that is, bodily responses. They are not behaviors that we choose to engage in. We do not choose to salivate when food is put in our mouth. Our body does that naturally. You will often see the initials US to indicate unconditioned stimulus and UR to indicate unconditioned response. Now that the last part of the definition makes sense to you, we have to examine the first part of the definition. What does it mean to call a stimulus neutral, and how does it later come to cause a response? Let's go back to Pavlov's dogs. After conditioning, Pavlov's laboratory dogs were salivating before the food was ever presented to them. They were salivating in anticipation of the food. They had learned to associate things in their environment with the food. Things in their environment that had been previously neutral for the dogs were now important signals that food was on its way, and this was making the dogs salivate. The scientist in Pavlov subsequently designed a series of experiments to understand this phenomenon. Science requires control and manipulation of variables. So Pavlov took control, primarily by identifying and isolating a neutral stimulus. Pavlov chose a metronome, a device used by musicians to mark time at the selected rate by giving a regular ticking sound, as his neutral stimulus. It is neutral because it does not cause the response. It is neutral with respect to the unconditioned stimulus. In this case, the sound of the metronome does not, in nature, cause the dog to salivate. Let's listen to a couple of metronomes. The conditioning process requires a pairing of the neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. In this case, the unconditioned stimulus is food. The food naturally causes the dog to salivate. Psychologists like to say that the food elicits salivation. Over many pairings, the dog will learn to associate the metronome with the food. Once this happens, the conditioning process is complete, and the dog will salivate to the sound of the metronome all by itself. Remember, before conditioning, the metronome is neutral. It does not elicit salivation. During conditioning, the metronome is paired with the food. The food elicits the salivation. After conditioning, the metronome all by itself elicits salivation. I think it is important to note that the natural response to food is not simply salivation. We are focusing on the salivation, but food triggers a complex digestive process that includes the secretion of hormones and enzymes. Here's a cool diagram. Before conditioning, food in the mouth elicits salivation, and the tone all by itself does not elicit salivation. During conditioning, the tone is paired with the food because the food elicits salivation. After conditioning, the tone all by itself elicits salivation. You can now see the initials CS to indicate conditioned stimulus and CR to indicate conditioned response. Remember that conditioned is another way of saying learned. So the conditioned stimulus, CS, is the learned stimulus, and the conditioned response, CR, is the learned response. Before we conclude this video tutorial, let's see how you do on some sample multiple choice questions. For Pavlov's dogs, the conditioned stimulus was it the tone? Was it the food? Was it salivation to the tone? Was it salivation to the food? Or was it none of the above? I'll give you a little time to think about it, or you can pause the video now to give yourself enough time. It was the tone. Remember, the conditioned stimulus is what was previously neutral. It did not cause the response until after conditioning. The dogs had to learn to respond to the tone. Let's try one more multiple choice question. For Pavlov's dogs, the unconditioned response was it the tone? Was it the food? Was it salivation to the tone? Was it salivation to the food? Or was it none of the above? I'll give you a little time to think about it, or you can pause the video now to give yourself enough time. It was salivation to the food. Remember, unconditioned means not learned, or that it is natural. Salivation is a natural response to food. This concludes our video tutorial on classical conditioning, focusing on Pavlov's early work with his dogs. There are more video tutorials on this topic that include human examples, how to get rid of a classical conditioned response, and how it relates to other types of learning. Thank you.